Many people who are concerned about their memory as they age will ask about forgetting. I want to know why, as people get older, they tell the same stories over and over again, same jokes over and over again. Yeah. Have they forgotten that they've said the joke, or are they just doing it for their own entertainment? Or I don't know, like what is this about? Like, I feel like someone needs to do that study. like why right. do people tell the same stories as they get older?
Well, I think there's a lot of reasons. And, a lot of memories do change with age, and some forms of memory, like source memory, tends to decline with age. You can't remember where you saw the headline or who you told the joke to. And sometimes I'll even say, have I told you this before? But sometimes it's just such a good joke or such a good memory. I'm like, I don't really care, because I'm going to tell it to you again because I'm enjoying this. And my kids will be like, yeah, we've heard that so many times. I'm like, yeah, but it's so good. So it's probably a little bit of both. But I think there's also some nostalgia. Like, we do share family histories this way. And I think, when families get together for Thanksgiving, there's this rehashing of, do you remember when this happened? It's like, yeah, we tell that story every time. A lot of our histories used to be oral histories where, we're telling stories and reminding people, and it's how we determine what foods were safe. But yeah, I can see it's certainly frustrating. And I think we think, gosh, I'm talking to this older person. They're telling me the same thing again, and you're nodding. But I take a certain amount of enjoyment from it. There's a nostalgia. There's also a feeling of familiarity. And so probably it's a collection of things. But you do see more pathological aging that people will completely forget. They'll say the same things. They'll ask, what's for dinner again? 5 minutes later, what's for dinner again? What's for dinner again? And that's where it's probably more concerning. But it is an interesting thing to note that as we get older, we might engage in that sort of behavior.
What is the consensus now on Alzheimer's and memory loss generally? Meaning, is it inevitable that people lose some amount of memory, and conditions like Alzheimer's are just a more rapid downward trajectory? And we could talk about superagers, these people that seem to maintain cognition well better than their peers anyway. Are there people who just, are sharp till the day they take their last breath, and that last breath comes in their 90s or even past 100?
Yeah, I think just the diversity that accompanies aging is really interesting. You could look at a 100-year-old who's doing really well and a 60-year-old who's not doing so well. So we can't just use kind of biological age as the marker. And as a psychologist, of course, I'm interested in psychological aspects. And there's, an old study on nuns who, it's interesting to see how you can test different people, but nuns are very committed to their profession. And you found that these nuns, how they age, some of them certainly when they passed away, their brains had these kind of hallmark signs of dementia, plaques and tangles. But behaviorally, they were still high functioning. So it's really interesting that the hardware shows what we see as dementia and specifically Alzheimer's disease, but their behavior was that of a fairly healthy cognitive person. So something else has to be going on. And, it could be, some people say it's having a sense of purpose. It could be having social connections. We know that's incredibly important. I think we do have a certain amount of control over it, and some of it might be based on physical exercise and sleep. So I know things you've talked about before. And some of it is having kind of a positive attitude about aging, that if you feel like some people say, well, it's all genetic, so what do I have to do? Well, if you go on a walk, some really good research shows that, walking 3-4 times a week can enhance hippocampal function, the part of the brain that's very involved in declarative memory. And that part of the brain, having turned 50 recently, tends to decline by about 1-2% a year in terms of volume. So this is kind of physical shrinkage of the brain. But in the walking group, the group that was randomly assigned to walk 3-4 times a week for 40 minutes, compared to a stretching group who's still engaging in exercise, but not cardiovascular exercise, the walking group, their hippocampus actually increased in volume by 1%. So you're changing the brain, but you're also changing the behavior. Their memory was much better a year later. So I think, if you saw a doctor and said, I'm having some memory problems, what can I do? Most people are looking for a pill, or, sometimes it's eat this or do that. But I think physical exercise can be so important. And it probably, the mechanism we don't know exactly, but it probably trickles down to things like improvements in sleep as well. If you're getting exercise, maybe earlier in the day, you're going to have better mood, you're going to sleep better. We know a lot of memory formation happens when you're sleeping. We know as we get older, our sleep quality tends to decline, even if our quantity tends to increase. So I think just knowing that there are some things we can do, and I'm using physical exercise as the example, and it doesn't have to be, the extreme version. Walking, dancing, a lot of people, enjoy being outside. That can be incredibly important to offset some of the things we do know can lead to dementia.
Was the walking vigorous?
In this group, I think it's really 30 to 40 minutes, and there's nothing special certainly about walking, but it's something where you can randomly assign people to either walk or engage in stretching. Mm-hmm. So if you're biking, if you're swimming, if you're dancing, any of these things can be beneficial. But here it's, you can randomly assign people to walk, and it should be at a rate where you're, there's research showing that the people who walk slightly faster actually live longer. So we're, you're not sure exactly.
So reverse causality there.
Could certainly be that. And a lot of this research, it's tough to do aging research because it's hard to randomly assign people to certain conditions. But I think as a psychologist, knowing that you have a little bit of control over the process is important. And I think, most people, when they talk about aging, they're so worried about dementia and, Alzheimer's disease as a specific form. But balance is even more important, I think. And most people aren't even aware of their balance. Mm-hmm. So 1 in 4 people over the age of 65 will experience a fall. And that fall can be very detrimental. You can break your hip, your collarbone. Often, you're getting up at night more frequently. You trip over a carpet or a rug. And, if you're in bed recovering from these falls, you're not walking, your hippocampus is shrinking. If you ask people, how's your balance? Most people are like, well, it's fine. I haven't had a fall. But there's a very simple test. We could do it now if you wanted, where you just stand up and see if you can balance on one leg for at least 10 seconds. And I have, when I do presentations, I do this ideally 30, 40 minutes into the presentation. We shouldn't be sitting for so long. And most people do pretty well. It's a younger group, and sometimes it's older adults I'm speaking to. And you can tell, I'm like, make sure you have something you can hold on to. And you can tell that balance changes considerably with age. And then I say, okay, now try doing it with your eyes closed. And I actually usually don't do this with my older adult group because then you see the younger people start to tip. And, we get a lot of cues from our visual environment for balance.
The older people tip.
Everyone. Yeah. You'll see the younger people start to tip.
Okay.
That's why it's even more surprising.
It's like a field sobriety test.
It very much is, but it's again, from this metacognitive standpoint where you think your balance is fine because you haven't had a fall, but you could be close to falling at any given point. And so, the cerebellum, the almost very primitive part of the brain, is involved in a lot of this. What's interesting with balance is it's very trainable. And so, there's parts of balance that are involved, visual, inner ear. But if you engage in some training, and it can be as simple as standing on one leg or doing yoga or Tai Chi, you can improve your balance considerably within a month or two. And so I think when I talk to older adults who, sometimes are even middle-aged, worried about their memory, I think balance is often overlooked, and it's something that's trainable. So I've started to do it a little bit, and I've noticed changes in my balance, sometimes good. I also notice I don't sleep well. My balance isn't as good. And I think that's probably the most important thing to be on the lookout for because, these things are related. If you lose your balance and you have a fall, you're not going to be engaging in physical exercise. Your memory is going to decline.
Yeah, the old skiers and the old surfers look to be in pretty awesome shape. There are a million confounds there. The sunlight, the social connection, the water, the cold, there are a bunch of things. Obviously, it's not just the skiing or the surfing, but there are certain sports where you look at the people and you say, okay, they're not the biggest and strongest, nor are they the ones with the most endurance, but on balance, they seem strong. Their posture looks good. Yeah. They seem relatively happy. Who knows, right? I'm intrigued by the fact that I look at a lot of these videos of super agers and athletes in their 70s, 80s, 90s who are doing remarkably well. It's very rare to see a video of athletes or non-athletes past 80 where they're breathing through their nose with their mouth shut. Almost always you see. Now, I'm not saying it's causal, but there does seem to be a shift in the way that people breathe as they get older. Just look at some of the, I forget his name now. He's a television personality who's been around a long. He's in his hundreds and he's been on YouTube and news programs recently. But at rest, it's like a mouth open breathing pattern. You kind of wonder whether or not they're getting enough oxygen to their brain. Yeah. And I do think that the shift in how we breathe, spontaneous movement, these things all go together. And I do think each component part needs to be looked at individually. So, okay, so it's the movement, it's the exercise, the novelty, the social connection, but ultimately there's a lot of other things going on. Like we know older people just don't move spontaneously very much. We had Twyla Tharp here, the world famous choreographer, and she's somewhere in her 80s. She can deadlift twice her body weight. Works out at 5 a.m. every morning for 2 hours.
Wow.
She boxed for a while, but actual boxing, because she's Twyla.
Right.
she's a really, she's got a lot of spirit. But she doesn't sit like I'm sitting, like kind of lazing back. She's fully active, and she's moving, she's nasal breathing unless she's speaking. Like her nervous system is turned on. I notice that and I go, God willing, I'll be like that. But I notice with each passing year, I take a few more opportunities to lean against things as opposed to standing up, not leaning against them, or starting to resemble the bulldogs I've owned. There's an opportunity to lie down, they lie down. If there's an opportunity, sleep. And I don't know that that's good. Maybe we need to nudge ourselves to be a little more active than we're comfortable.
Now, I think the insight is so important to be like, I notice I'm doing more of this, or I'm looking a lot like this, and I'm surprised. So things starting like posture or even breathing. And I think, I'm not an expert in this area, but just getting more oxygen to the brain is so important. And I think that's probably the mechanism for physical exercise. You're getting more oxygen to your brain, which really, as you get older, it's harder to do that. And so exercise might be kind of the mechanism that does that. And maybe with the advances, we're going to find other ways to do that. But I think that insight is really important. And it's also, we have age-based stereotypes of what happens. Like, as you get older, let's say, my knee hurts. And some people are like, oh, well, you're just getting older. Well, my other knee is the same age and it feels fine.
Good point.
So something's going on. Maybe there's some trauma, there's something, but it does give you this feeling like, hey, there's something I can do. Or maybe, I'm a firm believer like in physical therapy, like a lot of the exercises we do, if you keep doing the same thing, that's great, but then you lose a lot of the other, muscle mass. And, I think exercise, even walking, people will say it's really like a controlled form of losing your balance and regaining it, and losing your balance and regaining it. And so you add that into hiking, which has unpredictable surfaces, all these muscles that are, you're not using too often now have to be engaged. And so I think that coming back to like challenging yourself can be very important, putting yourself in uncomfortable positions. I mean, it's great to be on this podcast, but there's a time where I'm like, I'm not sure I want to do this, right? Like, how do you get that?
You're feeling that way now?
No, now I feel fine. But I think as we put ourselves in these uncomfortable positions, and I remember, when I first started teaching, like, gosh, 300 people, this is an uncomfortable situation. And one of my mentors said, you know what? There's only one thing you need to do, and that's breathe. Because you start to forget that, that is the most primitive thing to get oxygen to your brain, that then you can do what you probably can do quite well. And that's a psychological oversight where we just kind of start, I don't know if it's just mouth breathing, but as we get older, or there's more stress, we stop being aware of, the things that can really help us.
Yeah, I notice with each passing year, I get a little more difficult with myself about the little things, just like, so I try and, to this day, I would have to push myself to take the stairs a little bit faster than I want to. I don't take escalators unless there's no stairs available. When I travel, I find out, but I have to push, I have to, perhaps, collateral advantage of doing this podcast is I say things like that, and now I don't want to get spotted in an airport on an escalator. The other day, I normally train at a home gym, but I was in a commercial gym, and I was listening to music on my phone, and this kid came up to me and he tapped. He goes, "I thought you don't use your phone when you work out." I was like, sometimes I listen to things, I'm not texting and sending messages. And he's like, okay, it's like, wow, well, I have to be careful what I say. But it's nice. It actually has a forcing function, right? Sure. And I think that as we get older, there are a lot of things where we're not being observed. We know we should do them, but then we don't do them. And I think the injury thing is, and the pain thing is a big one. Yeah. I hear this all the time. like, yeah, I would exercise more, but I got this shoulder thing. I got this thing. And I think that's why there's so much excitement about these peptides, and it's still very unclear, what's going to be useful or not. Actually, there's a study out of Helen Blau's lab at Stanford on mice and humans where they found an inhibitor of the molecule that inhibits cartilage regeneration. They knock out this inhibitor, or they have a drug kind of analog that can do this in humans, and they observe regeneration of knee cartilage. I'm sure this is going to be sourced to pharma. That's going to be the path, because that's the typical path for labs at Stanford if they have a discovery like that. But how cool would that be?
Yeah.
Right now, knock on wood, I have like no joint issues, but how cool would that be? Because I think a lot of people just think, well, the body wears out.
Yeah.
The hip wears out, the knee wears out. And so when they have that pain, they don't think they could overcome it by movement. They assume, well, the chassis is kind of going, and then,
Yeah. Well, a lot of this, comes down to habits, and some of it is motivation, right? It's hard to get motivated to go to the gym. And as you get older, more aches and pains. It's like harder to get up. It's easier to sit down. But I think knowing you have some control over it, that, a lot of, especially in midlife, people have back pain. It's probably the most common thing, and it's probably from sitting. We work a lot, and especially in midlife, there's some interesting, it's not always a linear decline with age. And in fact, there's some interesting work on, happiness being more curvilinear, like midlife is actually some of the lowest levels of happiness and life satisfaction.
Really? Like our age? 50?
Yeah.
Really?
So I hope in some ways that can make, well, in some ways it can make,
great, but,
well, it can make you feel good, because it, a lot of people who might not feel great at 40 or 50, if you said, well, actually that's the lowest point in the graph, and it can actually get better with age, the title of my book. But it makes you realize that as we get older, there are more aches and pains. And yet, why are older adults, some of them who are fairly healthy and active, are doing really well? Whereas kind of when you're younger and your body's in decent shape, we're doing things like sitting, we're working a lot, we're stressed, we're not handling our emotions as well as we could. And so I think that's why aging is an interesting thing that, we think when we're young, that's, the best times in our lives. It actually might be some of the most confusing times.
Are you happier at 50 than you were at 40?
I think I am. I think I'm more content. But when I was at 20 or 30, I could do whatever I want. I could scuba dive, I could play basketball, I'd bounce back from an injury
were you
a week
happier?
later.
Was your internal landscape more peaceful or more hectic?
Absolutely not. And I actually see it in a lot of undergraduates who are like, it's a confusing time. You're trying to figure out what you want to do. You're in a different place. You have different partners. It's and yet we almost romanticize that college is the best time in your life.
Oh my God, no.
Yeah.
I'll say, even though I am very happy, 40 was rough. My 40th birthday, I was like, this is rough. And coming up in sciences, I loved doing it, loved the experience, but it was very stressful.
Yeah.
Raising money for your lab, a postdoc is a very uncertain time, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of stress.
Yeah.
And now I have stressors, but I view them differently. I feel completely differently about stress in general. I do a lot of things, but I don't think teen years, certainly not for me, or 20s or 30s are the best years of your life.
Yeah.
I can attest, like it didn't suck, but it was rough.
There's fun parts to it, and there's a lot of novelty, and you did things then that you probably wouldn't do now. But I think when we talk about aging, we're talking about how negative it can be and all these things that can happen physically. But a lot of the older adults I talk to and I've interviewed for my book are saying actually 60 or 70 was probably the best time in my life.
Nice.
Yeah, and that makes me feel, it's a select group who I'm talking to, but it's not like it's the best time in terms of my aches and pains or, sure, I wish I was 40 for some reasons, but those times can be very challenging and stressful. So from a psychological standpoint, it's interesting to look at these kind of nonlinear dynamics. It's not a linear decline. It's not that happiness just gets better with age. There can be this midlife dip. And, I'm not a clinical psychologist. Some people call this, midlife. Well, of course, there's a conflict at midlife. Well, there's really conflicts at every stage. Some of the, Erickson's work said every decade there's a conflict, and it's how you resolve it allows you to kind of move on to the next stage of life. And I think, sometimes we don't think about midlife as much as, well, this is what happens when you're young, and this is what happens when you're old. And it's probably how you deal with what happens in the middle, which allows you to age well. So when I talk about aging, most of the older adults I talk to, I'm not educating them on how to age well. They're there and they're doing it. it's often middle-aged people who are like, well, I have older parents. Most people when they're 20 or 30, they're not thinking, what's my life going to be like when I'm 70 or 80?
Yeah, even now that's hard for me to conceptualize.
Sure, yeah.
I just try and do the best I can to take care of myself every day so that maybe hopefully I'll hit 60, 70 feeling great. I actually feel better physically now than I did in my 40s and 30s, but I was working so much then. A lot of people, I'm not boasting, it's actually probably should be more of a point of shame. I don't know that I recommend it for most people. I worked non-stop. And I don't know that I'd wish that on anyone. I think a little more balance would have been healthy. Now I work a lot, but I definitely take time to meditate, to pray, spend time with people in my life. Like I really try and savor things a bit more.
Yeah.
The problem with academic science, as you know, is there's always a deadline or revision or something. There's always something. So once you realize there's always something.
I think it's in a lot of professions, people are very driven early. They have to prove themselves. You're trying to survive, make money, make a name for yourself, and that puts a lot of stress on you. And as you get further along, you might realize maybe it's not worth it, or maybe I need to backtrack, or maybe there's more important things. And I think it really does come down to balance. And, John Wooden, the UCLA basketball coach, I got to interview him. He was in his 90s. And he said it really comes down to two things. And I thought, oh, this is great. Coach Wooden is going to tell me, the two things. And he thought of himself as a teacher, not just a coach. So he did, a very effective thing. He had me guess those two things. The two most important words in the English language is how he said it. And here I am, a student again, and I'm thinking, gosh, he's a coach. So I don't know, success, teamwork, what is it? And he said, the most important thing is love. Be around the people you love, do the things you love. He lost his wife well before he passed away. He wouldn't sleep on her side of the bed. He would write her a letter every month.
Wow.
He had report cards from his grandchildren's on the wall right next to letters from presidents. So he's really surrounded by a great community. Former players calling, his former players were by his bedside when he passed away. And then the second most important word is something I think a lot of people struggle with. We're talking about is balance. And it's partly physical balance. He did have a fall, like we were talking about. And it's interesting because he had a life alert around, that he could press around his neck. And this is why I think technology is great. Maybe there's ways we can prevent falls but he fell in the middle of the night and he broke his collarbone and his wrist. And he had this life alert button, but he didn't press it.
Because of pride?
Exactly. He didn't want to bother anyone.
That's that Y chromosome.
Yeah, but you give people all this technology and then you realize there's a psychological part to it as well. He waited until the morning, his caretaker arrived, rushed him to the hospital. Thankfully, he survived. But that's pride, guilt, shame, didn't want to bother someone. So that's the physical balance. And then I think the mental balance, as he said, like you were saying, is he was a very driven person. Very successful with his coaching, but it meant a lot of time traveling, a lot of time away from his family, not focusing on the things that he found incredibly important. And as he got older, he felt like he could achieve more balance, spend more time doing the things he wanted, be around the people he wanted. And I think that's a struggle for a lot of people. We get really into something and, we forget about it. We're having a conversation. It's hard to stand up, it's, you get focused on things. But as you get older, maybe you're a little bit better at finding that balance and finding that peace.